little crime would be cold. That's why I got a heater for your thighs. And I know it's not your time, but bye-bye. And a word to the wise, when the fire dies, you think it's over, but it's just begun. Baby, don't cry. You had my heart, at least for the most part. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. We fell apart, let's make a new start. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. Yeah, yeah. But baby, don't cry.
What's up, my friends, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight I have a video to go over the Soviet biological weapons program. Sorry. So of course, it is all talked about in my book, but I am not going to reveal my entire book on my channel, but I am going to offer some insight into many of the aspects discussed in my book, many of the topics discussed in my book, and give enough clarification and insight that may not be in the book, but also to also promote my book at the same time without giving too much of it away, but also being able to explain in further depth some of the things that are discussed. So I wanted to go over the Soviet biological weapons program because very few people today realize the importance of the Russian biological weapons program, because it has more or less become unpopular to think Russia's involved with anything because of the hysteria stuff. And see, if you go back to World War I, like I do in my book, like I start in I start in the beginning, like even in the 1700s with the British using smallpox and stuff, and I go over the early attempts at biological warfare and such. But then in the first chapter I go into World War I, because that's when it really got rolling. The Germans started this sabotage campaign in World War I, where they went around infecting all the medical and military horses. And then what happened was this Spanish influenza situation took the world by storm, and the Russians thought that it was a weapon. The Russians thought that it was a British biological weapon, and because a lot of the fatalities were actually heavier on the Russian side. And so, not to mention, Germany had sent typhus into Russia as well through prisoners of war. So they were being hit not only with the Spanish influenza, but also with the typhus epidemics that ravaged the Soviet Union. I remember, I think it was Lenin. It may have been Lenin. I don't think it was Stalin. I think it was Lenin who said, either the Laos will defeat the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union will defeat the Laos. He's referring to lice, of course, which spread typhus. And they saw how much damage that it could do. And I'll even read a little quote from the defector, Ken Alabek. Let me see where that is. Hold on one sec. Okay. So it said, a year after taking power, in 1917, the Bolshevik government plunged into savage conflict with anti-communist forces determined to bring down the fledgling workers' state. Red and white armies clashed from Siberia to the Crimean Peninsula, and by the time hostilities ended in 1921, as many as 10 million people had lost their lives. The majority of the deaths did not result from injuries on the battlefield. They were caused by famine and disease. The casualties inflicted by a brutal epidemic of typhus from 1918 and 1921 made a deep impression on the commanders of the Red Army. Even if they knew nothing of the history of biological warfare, they could recognize that disease had served as a more potent weapon than bullets or artillery shells. So they started to see, just like Britain had started to see, just how effective those weapons could be, and like with the British using smallpox, they saw how it could just devastate these Native Americans who they thought were a threat to their colonies. And of course, the Soviet Union saw how much destruction and damage and death could be brought with these epidemics, and they saw the Spanish influenza, and they thought that was a British biological weapon, and it actually may have been, according to my research, and the typhus, of course, and this led the Soviet Union to say, okay, we need to concentrate all of our power and focus into biological warfare before anything else. I mean, they still got down with the chemical warfare and, of course, nuclear weapons and such, but biological warfare was like that was their thing. They said, this is the most important aspect. This is the weapon that is most important. And because it did not require fancy labs, it did not require costly raw materials, it could be done, with these homegrown labs that were very conservative and just easy to produce large amounts of weaponized microbes on a mass scale without much money. So that's basic, and you got to remember the Soviet Union, they did not have a lot of money. They were trying to, squeeze as much capability out of things with the least amount of money, and that's why biological warfare was one of those things that was like the cream of the crop for the Soviet Union. And, even if you were a developed nation, this would still be the case, because these kinds of weapons are able to be used, and you can say, oh, it was a natural outbreak. We didn't do that. It was just, it was an act of nature. And it could be waged against their enemies without the fear of retaliation, because it could not be linked as an attack with absolute certainty, unless, of course, they got caught in the act. So they started that, and they started that program. Once the communists took control, they really started getting going with the biological warfare, and they had an ideology or a brand of science which they called Lysenkoism. And Lysenko, Trofim Lysenko, he was an agricultural biologist, and he denied genetics, and he thought that he promoted this idea of acquired characteristics, in that the traits acquired during the lifetime could be passed down generations and remain as a characteristic. However, this in some ways is true about when we're talking about microbes and viruses, because they can impart qualities that can remain with them from a one-time deal. Through things like the bacteriophage and cell fusion, they can take on new antigens, new proteins. They can take on new genetic material that remains with them as they undergo cell division and make new microbes, like, you know, as they replicate. But Lysenko was always laughed at and deemed a pseudoscience, and Lysenko often would silence his political opponents by saying that anybody who promoted genetics and the Western idea of science, they were capitalists and such. And Stalin was really behind Lysenko. And, I mean, there's many books about it. I read one called Lysenko's Ghost. That was one that I had read. But, see, there were other people, like, there was a guy named Michurin. What was his name? Oh, I don't know. But there were other guys that were bioweapons specialists that were kind of using these Lysenko methods, and they had very unusual techniques, but it seems that they actually had some good results with what they were doing, and these clever approaches to modify biological agents in different ways using conservative techniques. And because it was done under the banner of Lysenko, the West kind of like scoffed at it and just said, oh, they're not accomplishing anything because, you know, they got that Lysenko thing going on. But they actually were making a lot of progress. And so the Soviet biological weapons program actually became the most advanced on Earth. And it was not just because of their focus on this, but also because of their intelligence networks. Like, they also had very effective counterintelligence networks and intelligence networks, and they acquired the German Insel Riems facility, and I will make a video specifically about Insel Riems. That's the facility in East Germany that Erich Traub worked at when he was under the Nazi Party, when he was working for the Nazis. And they also acquired the Japanese Unit 731. That was the Japanese biological warfare program. So they acquired the best of the best from Germany, and they were like the leading, they were the most advanced on Earth before they fell to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union just acquired them, so they became even more powerful. But then they also got all of the best from Japan. So when they acquired those after 1945, they had a major advantage over the West. And meanwhile, the West was still downplaying how effective germ warfare could be, and I think that was probably done because of the saboteurs and the spies within our system that were kind of telling them, oh no, germ weapons is no good. You can't make much progress in that area, you know, to give the Soviet Union more of a lead. So they acquired that. And so the first generation of biological weapons under the Soviet program was from 1918, I think, to 1972 or something like that. And then they, from 1972 to the fall of the Soviet Union, was considered the second generation of their biological warfare program. Yeah, from 1918 to 1972 was the first generation, 1973 to 1991, the second generation. And I think what had separated the two was that in 1973, I think they were like, all right, let's get rid of this Lysenko stuff and just concentrate on it without Lysenko's ideology or science. So there was a lot of intelligence reports, though, back when they were under that Lysenko banner, where they were making, so it seems like they were making a lot of progress with some original, clever, and conservative techniques in modifying pathogenic microbes. Now, in 1937, there was an expedition in Siberia where they started to weaponize ticks and tick-borne disease, and especially it saw the beginnings of these hemorrhagic fevers, which were these Ebola-like viruses, and they were the early forms of Ebola, and counter to popular opinion that these Ebola viruses are from Africa. They actually had their start in Russia, because these viruses are related to the ones from Siberia, these hemorrhagic fever viruses in Siberia. And the scientists that were involved in those expeditions, one was named Lev Zilber, and his colleague, who is like one of the top Soviet bioweaponeers for Stalin, his name was M.P. Chumakov, Mikhail P. Chumakov. And I am going to do a separate video about him too, because he is also a very important player in the story of the sleeper agent. He was very, very high up, and he was a biological weapons specialist. I have him linked to biological warfare, and especially these tick plagues. Now, these tick plagues, this was tick encephalitis. It was spread by ticks, but also these hemorrhagic fever viruses that were being spread by ticks. Apparently, even in 1937, these were laboratory-enhanced diseases, and Joseph Stalin kicked out all Western doctors from the Soviet Union during that time, and they were spreading these plagues among the Muslims and Mongolians, and it is said that they killed off about 2 to 3 million people with these experimental plagues. They would go and they would test these weapons on the Muslim and Mongolian population, because they were kind of like rebelling against Stalin and his Soviet Union. So he targeted them, and he would test out these weapons on them. And it's funny because Lev Zilber actually got jailed for intentionally spreading these epidemics, even though he was working for the people who jailed him. So it kind of seemed like he got set up. It's kind of like, maybe it was like Stalin was like, oh, go test these weapons on these restive populations, and then he went and he did what he was told, and then Stalin had these KGB guys go and arrest him, saying, oh, why are you spreading plagues, Stalin told me to. Kind of like that. It kind of seemed like he got set up. He got the shit end of the stick there. But this tick research was definitely linked to biological warfare. I have the intelligence reports, and it definitely links M.P. Chumakov to biological weapons work. Because he ran an institute, and everybody was saying, oh, he's just doing vaccine research. But actually, he was very involved in the biological warfare program. So, in 1937 to like 1938, these expeditions were going on, and they were testing these weapons out in Siberian regions. And then in 1938, a memorandum was circulating in the Soviet Union among Stalin and his generals, saying that bacteriological warfare was the weapon to fight future wars. And of course, that would also imply virus research too. But he said bacteriological warfare at the time, because, and I will tell you what that memorandum said. It said, so it's called Prospective Uses of Bacteriological Warfare in Future Wars, and it was circulating among Stalin's generals, and what they said in it was, the use of pathogenic microbes for military purposes is all the more promising since the propagation of virulent bacterial cultures does not require large plants with extensive equipment, costly raw materials, and complex techniques. And basically, I mean, it's a longer document, and it kind of lays out the history of how they got to that point, and they started, talking about how promising it was, how effective it was, and how promising it was, because it was, even though it was very immoral and it was just a detestable form of warfare. So that declaration was done in 1938, and they were modifying these things back then. Like I said in other videos, we did not need recombinant DNA technology to modify pathogens, and in fact, it was actually more desirable not to use that, because using these things like animal passages would be untraceable. It wouldn't leave a footprint that says, hey, this has been tampered with. So those expeditions and that declaration happened then, before World War II, and apparently the Soviet Union used biological warfare on the Nazis with tularemia at one point. And then after World War II, there was this, what I call Day X, and this brings up Alexander Kuzminov's information in his book Biological Espionage, and I want to make a quick note about this book in saying that he does put a considerable amount of disinformation in that book relating to specific events, which I have found to be, not true. Like he says that the Marburg outbreak, or the Marburg virus, that they acquired that virus by digging up the bodies of Marburg victims, when actually that did not happen. They got a strain from West Germany because they had an official exchange program, and MP Chumakov got the strain from West Germany. So that's just one example, but what I have found, however, the information that I have found to be reliable from that book is his basic structure of their penetration of the West and their plans and this Day X thing. I have found that Day X thing, which he says, in the book, one comes across, in the KGB files, one comes across this phrase Day X, which meant a large-scale war of bioterrorism against the West. And I have found that was already implemented in the beginning of the Cold War against the United States and against the West, and that it was done with the help of Erich Traub and, of course, other saboteurs and other spies that were already over here. And, of course, there was that cozy relationship between MP Chumakov and Albert B. Sabin, the inventor of the oral polio vaccine, and he teamed up with Chumakov to make that vaccine that would be given to all these Americans, and of course it was contaminated with an oncogenic virus. So, and I cover in the last chapter of my book all of that and how suspicious it was, and especially even Jonas Salk's role, because his was also contaminated. So I have found that yes, Kuzminov's book does have some disinformation in it, but there are certain things in it that are true, that I can back up and substantiate, and actually substantiate what I'm saying in my book. And that's the nature of a lot of this stuff with some of these KGB guys, is that they will deliberately put out disinformation, so you really have to like vet the information very well, and to keep in mind that they may be, you know, laying some traps here and there. But the general outline of what he's saying about the foreign penetration and all that stuff, I have found to be very true and is substantiated throughout my book. Then what we have were these two defectors. Now, we wouldn't have known of the massive Soviet biological weapons program if it was not for Vladimir Pasechnik, who had defected, I believe in the 80s, in the late 80s, to British, with the help of Britain. He went to Britain with the help of British intelligence. He exposed to them this massive program that the Soviet Union had. Like, massive program. It was bigger than any on Earth. And, of course, Ken Alibek, who was Vladimir Pasechnik's superior, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he too defected, but he defected to the United States. And then he wrote a book, of course, Biohazard. He wrote this book called Biohazard, about biopreparat, which is it's like Fort Detrick is the name of the program in America. The biological weapons program was operated by Fort Detrick, or Camp Detrick, the U.S. Army. Well, in Russia it was biopreparat. They were the ones overseeing the program in the Soviet Union. Of course, Porton Down was the name for the bioweapons program in Britain. So there was that incident in Sverdlovsk where anthrax had accidentally been released in 1979 during the time they were working on their bioweapons, and killed off many people in the nearby villages. And it aroused the suspicions of the West, and they were like, what's going on here? And the Soviet Union said, oh, it was just tainted meat that they ate. And then when Vladimir Pasechnik defected, of course, he was able to tell them that, no, it's actually, this was an accident that occurred when we were working on these bioweapons. Pasechnik was, I believe, murdered, but he died of a stroke in 2001, and I believe they had linked it to a chemical warfare agent that was used as an agent of assassination. They assassinated him. Ken Alibek, he is still alive, and of course I talked about how he had developed these psychotropic agents to induce altered mood and behavior in humans, and of course neurotropic qualities, just like Erich Traub had. Erich Traub was its pioneer, I would say. Long before Alibek. And so in Ken Alibek's book, of course, there was that talk of that tripartite blackmail, or that tripartite agreement. That was the off-record illegal tripartite agreement that was made between Britain, the United States, and Russia. That said, basically, we will keep our biological warfare quarrels to ourselves, and we will turn our heads the other way when we have knowledge of your biological weapons treaty violations. So it was more or less saying, you attack us, we won't say anything about it. And that more or less ensures continuous escalation and further bioterrorism and just allows this war to continue unfettered by any kind of attention by the press or anything, or by the U.S. intelligence, even when we're being attacked. I mean, essentially, it's treason. But that was the agreement that they fomented with this tripartite off-record agreement, which was signed. And I would love to see that document and who signed it. But of course, we don't have that information at this time. And of course, there was a very diabolical aspect of the Soviet biological weapons program. And like I've said in other videos, how this war is usually always fought through intelligence channels and through espionage and sabotage. Well, they had a diabolical program, vaccine sabotage, and they were trying to figure out how to overcome the so-called sterilization of vaccines and serum. And they found that it was much easier than is currently believed. And I'll read this quote. It's a very interesting quote. It's from an intelligence report about Soviet research, where they're talking about overcoming the sterilization of vaccines for sabotage purposes. It says, in connection with this work, it was established that microorganisms exhibit a much higher resistance to powerful chemical and physical influences than that which was ascribed to them hitherto. Thus, Boshan was able to isolate living cultures from nutritive media which had been boiled and autoclaved repeatedly. Having this high resistance, microorganisms do not perish either in the host organism or outside of it as easily as it had been assumed. Notwithstanding the prevalent view that a sterile vaccine contains only dead microorganisms, cultures of living microbes could be successfully grown from many formalinized vaccines. That's a chemical, of course. Formalinized vaccines and also some so-called chemical vaccines. Numerous investigations of immune anti-tetanus serum which had been treated with phenol revealed that a culture of tetanus microbes could be invariably isolated from it. The initial live microbe culture could also be isolated from immune anti-anthrax serum and the active swine plague virus from the immune serum used against that disease. The identification of the microbes and viruses in question was quite certain. Microbe cultures were also obtained from many other sera used for medical and veterinary purposes. So they realized that, okay, these microbes can persist a lot easier, and actually Insel Riems had been publishing about how binding these things with metals doesn't necessarily kill them, and actually the process was not only very uneven, since it doesn't happen like a first order chemical reaction, but it also that this process of binding to metal and inactivation was actually quite reversible. The exact phrase was highly reversible. So there's that. And also what became a big thing in the Soviet biological weapons program, just like in every other program, was this using of cloaking the research under benign research, and of course cloaking it under medical research, treatments, vaccines. Vaccines was always a very good cover because it could go both ways, and as long as they called it defensive research, they could get away with it, especially after 1972. Like Domaradsky, Igor V. Domaradsky, one of their bioweaponeers, had mentioned how in 1972, when they updated the Geneva Protocol that says that you couldn't have a bioweapons program or stockpile, they updated that and said well, you can do defensive research, but you just can't do offensive research. And it actually gave all countries the pretext to expand their offensive research by just calling it defensive research, because essentially offensive and defensive research is the same thing. Like they do the same research, but the only difference is your intention of how you use that information, whether you want to use it for weapons or to try to guard against weapons. And of course, all countries can't seem to help themselves when it comes to making weapons. So, and Domaratsky, of course, talked about the fact that a lot of these academic people, like the people that teamed up with a lot of the Western scientists and often communicated with them, he was basically saying they're all KGB guys. And he was saying that more or less anybody who was able to travel freely, it would have been a condition that they are informants to the KGB, if not outright KGB agents. And of course, Chumakov comes to mind there, but he says he does name V.M. Zadanov, and Zadanov was someone who was very friendly with Sabin as well, just like Chumakov, and I have correspondence between them. And he was somebody who was supposedly instrumental in the World Health Organization in their eradication of smallpox, and this guy was also a hardcore bioweaponeer for the Soviet Union. And he talked about, of course, how they would never call a spade a spade. They would never call a weapon on paper or in discussion. And that's an important thing to remember in this book, and I often talk about that concept, especially earlier in the book, because I kind of go over what I call the art of germ weapons, the 5 angles of biological warfare. And I should probably do a video on those 5 angles too. But back to this, we have that cloaking, and of course there was a popular facility in the Soviet biological weapons program in these Siberian regions where, of course, all of these tick epidemics had been started. They ended up setting up a few institutes there, which eventually became something called Vector. Vector became a very well-known bioweapons lab in the Soviet Union, and of course this was definitely true after the fall of the Soviet Union and into the Russian Federation. They were still doing that kind of research, and actually there was an explosion. They were working with all of the most dangerous viruses, and also things like those respiratory viruses and coronaviruses, and especially coronaviruses enhanced with HIV antigens they were working with. And there was an explosion there in 2019. And there were papers being published by Western intelligence saying, hey, we might have a full-scale pandemic on our hands not long from now after this explosion. And we're gonna keep our eyes on this situation. And of course, there was a worldwide pandemic not long after. But I won't get into that because there was another time where I got into that. My video got removed just for saying that. It's crazy. But Vector was one of those important labs to the Soviet biological weapons program, and even today. And so that's basically the gist of the Soviet biological weapons program. And you kind of have to go back to World War I to see how it got rolling and to see why it's still significant today. How hey, they were the ones who ended up with all of the best research from around the world, along with their spy networks. So this is the reason why, yeah, Russia's not very economically powerful, but when it comes to biological weapons research, they are number one. And if you read my book, The Sleeper Agent, you'll see how this is so. You'll see how this all plays out. It will make a lot more sense. So I'm going to leave it there, and I think in the next video we will cover in more depth MP Chumakov, whose son, Konstantin Chumakov, which I make no claims about, he's running vaccine safety at the FDA right now. I just think it's kind of a sensitive position, but that's just me. Alright, so we'll leave it there, and with that said, everybody take care of yourselves, be yourself, build yourself, and I will see you on the other side.